discuss other people. Gossip. Good minds discuss events. Great minds discuss ideas.
And the great mind I'm with today is Todd Williams, historian, pastor, counselor. What else? I mean, just kind of a website designer, WordPress expert. What else?
Yeah.
He's just a lot of stuff.
Theologian, IT professional,
Theologian,
husband, father, follower of Jesus, all the good stuff.
I love it. Well, before we get started, the thing I like to do is take a simultaneous sigh together, as we don't breathe deeply enough as people. And it's a good way to sort of, get on the same page. So blow out all your air, all the toxins that may have been building up in your lungs. Take the most giant breath you've ever taken, getting air behind your stomach, in your diaphragm, and release. Feels good.
Yeah.
Well, how you doing today, brother? Good to see you.
Yeah, same here. Doing pretty well. Just doing my church pastoring stuff, counseling stuff, IT professional, taking care of my kids, my wife.
How many kids do you have now?
So I have 3, with 1 on the way.
Wow.
Yeah, so number 4 awesome. Should be making his debut in May.
Beautiful. Well, let's just jump right into it. The thing that I've been asking people, and I let you know, is I just have this belief. I've heard it somewhere. I don't know. I've been building on this idea that everybody has about 3 to 5 core sermons, stump speeches, talking points that, when it comes down to it, after talking long enough in your life, these are the 3 to 5 things that you always come back to. And I just like hearing about yours. I like hearing about my friends. And so, Todd, first of all, do you agree that that's pretty much the case with people, that they have, about 3 to 5?
Yeah, I think it's pretty fair. I mean, you tie in worldview, right? And once you kind of have an established worldview, there's 3 to 5 things, I would agree with that, that really are pivot points to propel you forward in your worldview, your value system, things like that. Yeah.
No. Okay. Well, what are you've had time to think about it. What are your 5? Do you want to just list them to me, and then start with number 1, or start with the most important one to you?
Sure.
Excuse me.
So I know we won't get through all of these, but my mind is a very systematic mind. So I've got 5 core things which can characteristically be different than the 5 things I talk about the most. So the 5 core things, I mean, there's some overlap, right? But the 5 core things would be time with family. That is a value that affects a lot of my decision making. Number 2 would be things that how do things square with Scripture? A lot of the Christian worldview is built on the teachings of Scripture and how we read and take that. So how do things square with Scripture? Number 3, what is the role of worldview and mythos in understanding things? Number 4, this is my cynical part. What is the hidden agenda or the ulterior motives for things that are put forth? And then number 5, what is most honoring to God? Now, conversation topics, those 5 would be wanting to be present with my family. I talk about that a lot. Number 2, the importance of historical context and how it informs things. Number 3, what is the role of God's hand in our situations and in our guidance, especially when we find ourselves in what's called the valley of decisions? Number 4, whatever I'm currently interested in or researching. I really geek out on stuff. And then number 5, what does God think about something so that I can learn about it accordingly? So, yeah.
Well, in hearing those, there's definitely some overlap. Where would you say the biggest overlap is, where you see two that are pretty much identical?
Well, identical.
Identical, pretty much the same. Like
Right. So pretty much the same. Time with the family is a pretty big overlap, 1-on-1.
Yeah.
The role of God in situations and what God thinks about stuff is really interconnected with the role of the Judeo-Christian worldview.
Yeah.
And so there's a big overlap there.
Let's start with that one. That's the one that caught my attention. If you don't mind, or is that an important one to you? Do you feel like that is a good place to start? Yeah.
Sure, absolutely. Ask a starting question.
Well, why would it come up when you're talking with other people? What conversation has it come up in recently? When a topic, what sort of context does that come up in?
Every context. So real life examples. I currently work as an IT professional in a public school district. And if you know anything about the IT world, it trends a little bit more towards leftism and liberalism. And me being a pastor who is pretty conservative, has very strong views on the scriptures and how things are viewed through the lens of scripture, through fallen nature. I have a different value system that shows up than a lot of my coworkers and my peers. And so there are things that when I'm in, Christian company, I would take for granted as a common ground, which is not common ground whatsoever. There's very little commonality I have with my coworkers other than how do computers work. So, there's a whole morality structure that is antithetical, I would say, to the Judeo-Christian worldview that kind of permeates a lot of the IT arena, especially in the public sector.
But I mean, a lot of it does come down to practical. How does a computer work, though, right? So when would this come up?
Well, it would come up in the average everyday conversations, and social interactions. It comes up in policy. So in a public school district, you're dealing with an institution that is dedicated to the DEI principle, diversity, equity, and inclusion. So in some ways, socially, there are preferential treatments to people who aren't necessarily qualified for the position based on something other than qualifications. And now how do you offer equitable support for something like that? And then you got, there's different sides of the spectrum with that. But then also, as a Christian walking into this, I have a high ethical grounding of what's right and what's wrong, no matter how I feel about it. Where my coworkers, like even one of them just recently made the comment, like, this one person in the district has been so problematic and so hostile towards me. It makes me not want to be as speedy in responding to their tech problems. So there's this value system where if you shaft me, then hey, I'm going to shaft you, which is not really in line with scripture or the Christian principles. So even the way we approach customer service, so to speak, like is affected by our worldview, is affected by our value systems.
But you don't seem like, the years I've known you, you've never been a quarrelsome guy. However, you've always stuck by your beliefs and you've always had sort of a counselor take on things. And so is that how you approach it? Do you start asking them questions, or how do you deal with these situations? Are you clashing heads a lot with these people?
No, and mostly because I have what Jordan Peterson would call an agreeable personality. So you have the agreeable and you have the aggressive, the assertives, right? I'm not an aggressive. I don't live for the fight. And so one of the things that in one of the Christian views that affects the way I think is seeing people in like the eyes of they are created in God's image. And so they are due the dignity and the respect of that. And also knowing that anybody who's not following the Lord is in a lost and fallen world, and they're grasping at straws to find a meaning for something that is ultimately going to perish. It makes me look at people, even in the heat of their frustration. Like I look at them and I can sympathize with them because I face the same frustrations. I mean, like I have bad people that I have to work with too, who have bad attitudes. And how can I be Christ to my customers, so to speak? How can I be Christ to my coworkers? And we just did a message on James 1, and one of the things that James instructs us is something I think is a very good practice to build into is that let your ears be bigger than your mouth. Listen, be quick to listen, slow to speak, slow to anger, right? When you hear other people, you can get past the agitation, you can get past the attitude, and you can hear the hurt, and you can hear the sincerity, and you can hear just the sadness there. And to be able to frame that internally for me when I interact with them can help me give a more gracious response to them and be more of a peacemaker than a rumbler.
What is there a phrase that comes up a lot that you find you hear yourself saying a lot with coworkers?
Well, nothing that's super productive. Just something more like, "Yeah, I hear you," or "That's how it is." That's the way this is going. It's a more of a commiseration, right? So you identify where they're at. If there is a chance for a deeper conversation, then we'll take it. I've got another believer that's on my team, and so we actually get a chance to debrief at lunch every once in a while. And actually, my boss is a really good believer too, and so it's really nice to be able to talk with her about it. But then also to come back to the team and try to take a little bit of the high ground in hopes of being an example for them to see.
Well, I guess I want to sort of get to the source when you're talking about these things, when you're dealing with these things verbally. I'm sure like emotionally there's a lot going on when you hear certain things, but how do you bring it back to God and his perspective when you're talking to non-believers?
Well, at this stage, I don't believe that I've gotten the, how do you say it, like the invite to speak on that category in their lives. So you have to wait for those opportunities, and then you have to approach it in a way that doesn't feel like you're like a sleazy car salesman, So one example, like one of my coworkers, like his wife has had some like health things, and so I've in the last year I've been deep diving into kind of like food as medicine principles, and like my exposure to the medical community during the COVID thing has just been not optimal on the medical community. I'll just say it that way.
You've had bad experiences.
Well, I've had bad experiences, and I've had to deal with public policies that have forced me to have bad experiences because I work in a public sector. So I'm a little bit more hesitant about what the authorities say if I don't have the evidence, and it's caused me to go on a deep dive of the evidence. It's caused me to go on a deep dive of like, where's the money going on? Okay, so that's the cynical side. I'll stop right there.
Well, no. That you don't stop right there. Let's keep going with that. I like that.
Well, it's because it's a rabbit trail, right? Because I went on this intellectual journey, right? I deep dove into food as medicine and food to improve the quality of life, not the standard American diet. And so I've come across like some remedies that just have happened to happen to people in this research that his wife would identify with those issues, right? And so there was an opportunity, one, for me to say, hey, you might try eliminating X, Y, and Z out of her diet, and you might try introducing X, Y, and Z into her diet as a means of kind of counteracting that. And since he was in a vulnerable spot, I was able to do it respectfully. I was like, I can send you a link to some sources if you're interested, because I'm not going to push it down your throat. But I also know this is it's a medical thing, and that can be a challenge as well. So like, I know you're not. I even said this. I was like, I know you're not where I'm at in terms of like spirituality, but I'll be praying for your wife. So it offers a sense of goodwill. It offers a sense of respect, of camaraderie with where he's at, without being aggressive and shoving it down his throat.
I like that. I guess that brings me to the question of how do you keep from preaching? You're a preacher. You have strong beliefs, and like me, you probably, especially during the pandemic, there were times that it was really hard to keep, to bite your tongue, or maybe not. I'm actually just mind reading, and because I've known you for a long time, but maybe I'm wrong. But have you had a chance to really express yourself to others that maybe that disagree? Or I'm sure there's a lot of times in your work in particular where there are things that are talked about that are almost antithetical to what your experience has been, or to what you have learned in your search for truth and search for knowledge. What do you do? Have you had any opportunity to argue?
A little bit. Like I said, for the most part, I'm not an argumentative person.
Yeah.
So that's not something that I like to jump to. Right. There's a couple of caveats. I'm bivocational, right? So I'm an IT professional, and I'm also a pastor, which is kind of a luxury and a challenge that most people don't have. The luxury part of that is I have a platform. So I can vent, I can express some of my serious feelings about this stuff through the rubric of Scripture, right, to my congregation. Now, it's not that I'm preaching, like this is the mandate from the Lord kind of a thing, but to say like, how does this square with Scripture? So we can challenge things based on Scripture. I've even had people leave the church because of some of the stuff that has gone on, which, people do what people do.
Leave the church because of your beliefs or what you've preached?
What I preached and what people have shared during the sharing times and stuff like that. Yeah. So, I mean, like, it happens. I mean, because not everybody's on the same page, and I know that, and I understand that.
Yeah.
And, and I challenge my own viewpoints just as much as the next. I don't think that I'm always in the right. One of the things that guides me as a minister is that, like, I know what Scripture says, and I know what the different interpretation styles are, and I know what I believe, and I know, for the most part, there's a little bit of each of those that's right, and there's a little bit of some of those that may not be right, and I would like to stay humble enough to know that I'm not above correction if I don't understand something right. So the thing I told a family member several years ago when we were first getting into this faith talk was that I don't have any doubt or any problem whatsoever with the inspiration of Scripture. What I do have a problem is our insistence on the inspiration of our interpretation of Scripture.
Yeah.
Because once we get to that point, I think we're dead in the water. I think that the interpretation of Scripture is deep and complex as the molecules are and as the universe is. Like, now, is the gospel simple enough for a child to understand? Yes. But if you want to plumb the depths of God, you better be ready for a lot of mistakes and be humble to accept that.
That reminds me of one of the 5 things you brought up. What was it? Doesn't that pertain to one of the things that you come back to about Scripture and interpretation of Scripture?
Yeah. So let me pull it up here. How do things square away with Scripture?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, I guess when you say dead in the water, what do you mean by that? Because we can interpret the Scripture, right?
So by dead in the water, this is what I mean. When we get to a point, do I need to be closer? Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can. Yeah.
When we get to a point where we believe that we have the monopoly on the interpretation of Scripture, I think that is dangerous territory, because one of the things that qualifies people to be a leader in the church, in my opinion, according to Scripture, is that they maintain a teachable spirit. And once we have the monopoly on doctrine, then we become unteachable. And if we do have error, we start making an idol out of our doctrinal interpretations more than we do out of what God is speaking through Scripture.
Okay, yeah, I see what you're saying. You don't mean by saying that when we get into interpretation of Scripture, what I hear you saying is if we become absolute about certain interpretations and no wiggle room, just absolute, then that's when we're, like you said, dead in the water. We're not effective. We become dogmatic.
Well, yeah, dogmatic. I know dogmatic tends to get like a negative press. So when we get to the point where we don't think that we could be wrong in our interpretation of Scripture, what I think happens is that we basically turn even the grace in Scripture into a law, because we're removing the relational element from it.
Say more about what is that? What is the emotional? I mean, the relational element. What's that?
The whole premise of the gospel is that we as humans have an active relationship with our God. That relationship involves communication, it involves dialogue, it involves trust, it involves all of the human experiences that we would experience with a relationship with another human being on a relationship with a divine being, which means it's dynamic, and some things change and some things are uber personal, some things are static, and we have to understand that. And when we think that we have the monopoly on everything, every truth there is to learn about Scripture and whatever doctrine we pick, then we're starting to put God into a static box, and we're losing the dynamic relationship aspect of it.
Now, what happens though when that dynamism becomes willy-nilly? Like, what is the standard? What is when it comes to interpretation, how do we keep it unified?
The simple answer, and the hard thing to do, is to maintain an active relationship with Jesus. Because it's not, when we get into doctrine, when we get into theology, even when we get into hermeneutics, how we interpret Scripture, all of that's good and great. The problem is that when we do that as an intellectual pursuit or as a philosophy, because I think in a lot of ways the term theology is really just philosophy repackaged with a God element thrown into it. When we start doing that, we turn the idea of God into an idea and into an intellectual exercise to make sure it's logically consistent, and we stop having a relationship with Him.
Mhm.
You
Mhm.
know, like I know my wife, right? Like I know her very well. And so I will know when something's out of character. When somebody says something
Mhm.
that's not true about her, like I'm going to know that. I believe that same dynamic is present when we have an active, thriving walk with our living God. That when
Mm.
somebody interprets something contrary to His character, we're going to know it. And I believe that the
Mm.
scriptures create a baseline, creates like the standard, right? Like what's holy, what's not holy. It creates a
Mm.
standard of like objective morality. It creates a standard of like how we need to approach God, and then from there
It's
we build a relationship.
but it's subjective, but but it's not it's very organic from what you're saying. It's relational, so it can be different for everybody then, huh?
Well, so the way we interact with God can be different. The expectations, right, on what
Mhm.
proper conduct is very clearly spelled out. Um, and I think part of the interpretation of Scripture has to involve like how God has revealed parts of Himself to His people over roughly a 3,000 year period, right? Because that's
Mm.
roughly what Scripture
Mm.
deals with, right? So
Mhm.
we we can't just pull something out of Deuteronomy willy nilly and say
Mm.
this is this is practical and applicable for all people at all times and all cultures. Like,
Mm.
you know what? I eat pig. I make my own pork belly bacon.
Mm.
That would never be allowed, right? So
Yeah.
what I can do is say, let's take the conservative dating of the Bible. Genesis through Deuteronomy was roughly written 1440 BC. Matthew was written roughly 50 BC, 50 AD. The Revelation of John was written about 90, something like that. So, like, we have a huge time frame. If I were to read through Scripture, I see how God's interacting with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. I see how God interacts with Adam and Eve. I see how God interacts with um, Joshua, how he
Mm.
interacts with the judges, how he interacts with the prophets, how he
Mm.
interacts with King David writing the Psalms, how he interacts with his disciples in the Gospels, how he interacts with Paul as he's talking to churches. I have this huge swath of samples of how God interacts with people, and I can start building a
Mm.
character profile about what God is like, what God's heart is, and I can
Mm.
also build a profile of what He finds pleasing and what He finds detestable. Now, based on that profile, if you want to take a psychological approach, I can either choose to meet Him in the areas that He has chosen and has preferred, or I can choose to do something that He is not preferring and does not like, and in a sense reject Him, just like any other relationship.
I like that. And that hence the relational aspect of it. Well, I think you're I am a little not surprised, but I think would you say that you have this has become more of a focus for you? Maybe you've thought a lot about it a lot more since the last time we've talked. Of course, last time we talked was what, like 10 years ago, or
Right?
20.
Yeah, right. Yeah, I mean, I think uh, I've evolved a lot. You could
Hmm.
say I've grown. You could say I've matured. But life experiences like change your perception
Yeah.
of things. Like
Yeah.
would I be saying these exact same things 7 years ago when I didn't have any kids? Probably not. Right now,
Some
I've
of the
got
same things.
some.
It's like you're not like a completely different person, but I
Yeah,
do see
no,
a new emphasis, a
yeah,
new
yeah.
sort of, yeah.
Because you're familiar with the Enneagram, right? You've probably heard
Hmm.
about that. So I know a lot of people are like, oh, stay away from that. It's cultic. I'm very skeptical about like cultic stuff. We do Halloween. You know what? The kids are eating candy and they're dressing up like princesses. I don't. You know what? Um, Greater is He that's in me than he that's in the world. I don't think that there's a demon trying to take me out everywhere I go. I'm not too worried
Yeah.
about it. Enneagram, they got a couple of things right. I'm a 5, which means I'm an egghead. You didn't need the Enneagram to know that. Like I get a deep dive into information. I really geek out on it. Like that's how I ended up into IT. I started really geeking out on building my own computer systems. I'm like, hey, I can make some money on this. So I've changed because I deep dive into stuff, and I always have a curiosity and a need to learn. It doesn't really matter what it is. It's a need to learn. Case in point, I just got introduced to Michael Heiser. Rest his soul, he just passed away in April, but he was a theologian that was part of the Logos Bible software programs. And he wrote a ground-shaking piece of work called The Unseen Realm, which really goes back and revisits the view of angels and demons in the Bible. And I like what he says. It's not your typical Western theologian way of looking at things. But what he's done is, I think he's done a good job in recapturing part of the worldview of the first century Judaism, based on the most recent research that's come out of the Dead Sea Scrolls. And it's revamped the way that he looked at the supernatural realm and in the categories of spiritual beings that he now calls the divine council. And it's not typical like Christian theology, angelology. It's something a little bit different. And some conservatives hear him and they go, oh, he believes in multiple gods. And it's like, there's some challenges to it, but there's some interesting stuff there. So I'm curious. So I started deep diving into it.
Okay.
I started deep diving into how to do parenting as well as I can. I want to learn. I want to keep my mind active. I just bought a Humble Bundle course on project management to learn skills in project management to make it the next career step. So you name it. Like if I got an interest, I'll deep dive in it. I'm eating. Yeah.
Well, we're almost out of time, but I want to know, give me one major thing that you've learned that you can help me with, or all of us that are listening right now. What's something that you've learned that we might be able to benefit from about parenting?
Anytime there's a conflict with the kids, somewhere down the road, there's been a breakdown in the relationship.
Say more about that real quick. That's really interesting. What is that?
So if I, go up to my daughter and I say, hey, go clean your room. Right. And I get resistance. That resistance, part of it's human nature, rebellious nature, right? I mean, that's just part of it. She doesn't do it. What happens? It triggers me. I said, go clean your room. No, right? There's going to be consequences when we take something away, right? So it begins this breakdown of the relational aspect, because at some point, I'm not treating her as like a person that I love and adore. I'm treating her as an adversary. You can't build trust and relationship in an adversarial context. So there are other approaches to take. But usually if it gets to that point, it's because I have checked out emotionally somewhere in the process. It's either I've had a long day at work, or I've had a rough run, and there's just a part of me that wants to be selfish and sit down on my cell phone or watch something goofy on TV. And I don't want to deal with this. I just want her to do what she's told to do. That's on me, man. That's on me, because I broke down the relationship.
That's really good. Yeah, I've often found it's actually not something I do very well in my family, but that being clear about expectations and having like almost like a family constitution is really helpful, so that it's not about my will versus yours. It's about, this is what we agreed on, and this is the consequence we agreed on. And we both know, I know better than you about this, but this is what we agreed on. when you were in your right mind and I was in my right mind, we talked about this. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think, do you think that of course we're going to get into these power struggles, but do you think that a good way to remedy them is coming back and in a space of reconciliation, and
Absolutely.
admitting our faults, but also being clear about our boundaries and expectations, rules, boundaries, and expectations, and but being able to be vulnerable and
Yeah.
reconciliatory. Is that a word? Reconciliatory.
Yeah. One of the things that set the stage, Shannon credits it to me. I don't remember it being this way, but hey, she remembers it. When we first got together, I basically set the precedent that when we hurt each other, we need to sit down sooner rather than later, and like the trigger word, right, to let us know we need to deal with this is that I need to have a vulnerable moment. And then that means that like defenses are down, retaliation is down. We speak the vulnerability, and then the person who did the offending has to like identify with it, own it, and apologize for it. And we're implementing that with the kids now too. So good example, just the other night, I have a routine with the two oldest, Ellie and Finn. When they go to bed, I will kneel down next to their bed after we do our prayers and everything. Lights are out, they're tucked in, and I'll sit there quietly with them for 2 minutes. And I count in my head backwards from 120. And when I say 2 minutes are up, and I give them both a kiss, I say good night, sweet dreams, and I close the door. If I'm sick, then I don't do the 2 minutes, right? Because I'm sick. If I'm really tired, sometimes I have not done the 2 minutes. And there was one night where they weren't listening well, and I was just being a little less than patient with them. And so then I, went to bed and was like, oh, the 2 minutes. Like, no, you guys haven't been good. I'm not going to do the 2 minutes. And it really upset them. I closed the door, and Shannon, she was in the other room, and she heard what happened. She's like, tonight, emotionally, they really need those 2 minutes. I was like, So I went to the kitchen. I had a heartburn at the moment because I wasn't feeling well. So I took my heartburn medicine, and I went back in. And the kids were like, what are you doing, Daddy? And I said, I wasn't going to give you the 2 minutes because I was really frustrated. And I said, that's not fair to you. I said, I'm sorry for that. Will you forgive me? And they said, yes, because we're introducing forgiveness language. And I said, I'm going to sit here with you guys for 2 minutes because that's special and it's important and I love you. So yeah, we're trying to build that as a routine that when we know that we blew it, we're going to go back and we're going to make it right because we need to live that example. We're telling them they need to say they're sorry and to forgive each other every time they get into a tussle. And we need to live that. And so we're beginning to implement that actively in our relationship with them.
I love it. I love it, man. Setting up systems, setting up expectations, rules, boundaries, and expectations that for yourself as well as them, systems that institute those things. It's work that, if it's done right, it will save a lot of heartache on the other end, right, later on.
So your phrase, systems, rules, and boundaries, right? Why are we doing that in our family? So that we can.
Well, actually, was saying systems, rules, and expectations. But boundaries is also,
right.
But boundaries is also like that's
right. So, but we're doing that so that we can have a thriving relationship with our kids.
Yeah.
And that's the approach I take to Scripture in our relationship with God. He sets up the systems, the rules, the expectations, so we can have a thriving relationship with Him.
Yeah.
Got to tie it in, man. I'm a preacher.
I'm bringing it all together. All right, brother. Well, there's a lot more I want to talk to you about, but we can do this again some other time. That's what the beauty of you know, the internet is.
Yeah.
Easiness of just getting on here. So thanks a lot for joining me today, man.
Yeah.
I feel like I've been missing my friends, especially the ones that are far away like you. And Dave Tackett was on last night. I don't know if you saw that one. And Dave Tackett is he's watching, and he says, "Don't pass." Oh, he was watching when we were when we were holding our breath. Out. He was watching. And then Will Ramey says, "I agree with the last statement." And I forget when I wish I had put it on here, but he's in agreement with a lot of what we're talking about, it looks like, and I appreciate you tuning in, Will, and everybody who's tuning in. Feel free to go to Ramble Source on YouTube, and you will find all the conversations I'm having there. And I also break them up into little bite-sized YouTube shorts. Those, you ever watch those YouTube shorts?
Oh yeah.
Peterson, Jordan Peterson. There's a lot of great ones out there. And it is sometimes it's true. We'll talk about that next time, maybe. Well, thank you, brother. And I'll let you both of us have to get up early for work, but we'll do this again sometime.
Yeah. Just reach out, man. We'll put it on the calendar. We'll make it happen. We'd love to do it again.
Sounds good. Well, I've always appreciated your wisdom and thoughtfulness, and you came through again. So I appreciate it, brother. I'll talk to you.